What's good, YouTube? Welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the Mercury-Saturn planetary combination. This video is applicable for you if you have Mercury in any hard aspect with Saturn, such as a conjunction, which technically is not an aspect, but a conjunction, a square, semi-square, sesqui-square, opposition, and even if you have this combination in contact with each other via a declination, such as a parallel or a contraparallel. This is not to say that this video is not going to be applicable if you don't have a hard aspect and instead you have a soft aspect, such as a sextile or a trine. But what it is saying is that hard aspects do materialize and they do represent concrete events that happen in a person's life, while soft aspects are more free flowing and they're not as abrupt. So, with that being said, before I get into the Mercury Saturn planetary combination, I want to mention, I want to talk about each of these planetary bodies individually, so that way we can have a greater understanding of what they mean when they come together and why these two planets can manifest in the way that they do when they do come together. And so Mercury is a fast moving planet. Mercury can never be more than like 27 to 28 degrees away from the sun. And Mercury represents travel for that very reason. He's very swift in motion. And if you look at the glyph of Mercury, you'll see that he has wings. Actually, the glyph of Mercury to me looks like a little child with their hands up in the air, which is, on point because Mercury does represent children and young people. But from a just in terms of the characteristics, Mercury represents speech, communication, writing, intellect, young people, humor, and news, gossip. And from a medical astrology perspective, Mercury has rulership over the head, the tongue, the speech organs, the arms, the forearms included, as well as the small intestine, which is where digestion takes place. And that is because, just to segue onto that for a little bit, that's because when you think about the digestive system, that is where all our foods come together, or everything that we eat come together before it is assimilated and to go to different parts of the body. And that is a very technical and analytical thing that happens within our body. And that makes me think about Mercury and Virgo specifically, because we know that Mercury has rulership over the two zodiacal signs, Gemini and Virgo. Now, Saturn is a slow moving social planet. So, whereas Mercury can go around the entire zodiac in, I think, about 78 days, it takes Saturn 29 and a half years to traverse through the entire to traverse through the entire zodiac. So very, very different. So we're pitting a slow planet with a very fast planet. So within astrology, what that means is that Saturn is the planet that is going to be superior, and Saturn is going to be impressing his manner upon Mercury, and not necessarily vice versa. A little, you'll see a little bit of that, but mainly Saturn is going to be the one that's influencing Mercury for the most part. Saturn represents commitment, time, structure, boundaries, responsibility. I always like to talk about how Saturn has these great rings around him, which symbolize commitment and structure and boundaries. Literally, when you look at Saturn, he's enclosed by these rings around him, and that symbolically does represent structure. Saturn also represents government and how we organize the world around us so where we can live a life that is not chaotic and where there's rules and responsibilities and obligations. Saturn also represents restriction, isolation, imprisonment, and older people. And from a medical astrology perspective, because Saturn has rulership over structures, Saturn represents our skin as well as our skeletal system, and Saturn represents our excretory system because Saturn represents things that are going away or things that are released, or your excretory system is where the food comes out, and Saturn can represent, decay and trash and things that are not so pleasant. So that could include like the bladder, um, the anus, the rectum, all of those things that's going to fall under Saturn. And also, from a medical astrology perspective, Saturn represents anything that is hypofunctioning or that is not functioning optimally. So anything that is slow or sluggish. And so when these two planets come together, interestingly enough, it's not as challenging as you may think. Granted, any personal planet having a contact with Saturn is going to be challenging, but Mercury and Saturn actually have more in common than you may think. Both Mercury and Saturn have rulership over the triplicity, over the air triplicity. So I have a video about triplicity rulers. Check that out if you want to learn more about that. But triplicity is just another word for element. So both Mercury and Saturn have rulership over the air element. And just think about how Mercury rules over Gemini and how Saturn is exalted in Libra and has rulership over Aquarius, and those are all air signs. And so what happens is that when these two planets come together, more so than anything, it represents a depth of thought. This combination is really great for people that are working with some sort of advanced or difficult subject. I learned that from the astrologer Antoine Garth. His channel is Garth Astro on YouTube, GarthAstro. Definitely check his channel out because he has a lot of content surrounding traditional astrology if you're interested in that sort of thing. But he speaks about how Mercury and Saturn can represent someone that is adept at wrestling with difficult subjects such as chemistry, accounting, statistics, biology, any hard science, or any subject that requires you to spend a lot of time in solitude where you have to study, practice, and research for a long period of time. This is a great aspect for concentration and being able to see things through to the end. And that's because with Saturn, Saturn can be all business and no fun. And Mercury is a very superficial planet. He represents children and youthfulness. But when he's with Saturn, Saturn is going to deepen Mercury and make Mercury grow up and become much more serious and astute. And that can definitely translate to someone who is interested in very adult or very advanced like subjects. Um, I've also noticed that from my own personal observation that Mercury Saturn people enjoy mental tests. So crossword puzzles, Sudoku, playing games on the computer that require you to have to strategize. You can even include chess or checkers in this because it requires you to strategize and think about your next move. Mercury Saturn people from a psychological standpoint are people that don't tend to do anything or say anything without thinking about it. So that can be kind of interesting because if you've ever had a Mercury Saturn person say something really mean to you, which is not uncommon with Mercury and Saturn, but if they have, it isn't something that just came out of nowhere. They are very contemplative about what they say, and so there's another level of diabolicalness, if that's a word, to that you may want to consider. But just in general, Mercury Saturn people are very conservative when they're thinking, and they do tend to strategize and use their mind in a way that is much more pragmatic and logical. And in that vein, they may not necessarily appreciate the more nebulous topics of life. They may be more so concerned with serious subjects like, again, the sciences, but even politics, um, even the occult, because the occult can be very serious as well. So the occult. So sometimes we can see religion be a theme that comes up with Mercury and Saturn. We can sometimes see philosophy be a thing that comes up because these people are deep thinkers and they tend to really like to contemplate on the meaning of life and why things are the way that it is. Now, um, from a career standpoint, Mercury Saturn is really good for working in a field where, like, the first thing that comes to my mind is accounting, because the one thing about Saturn is very exacting. That's why Saturn is exalted in Libra. Just think about how Libra represents the scales of justice, and how when you look at the scales, any little motion and you could tip the scales in an opposite direction. So with Saturn is able to be very exact and to be extremely precise. And so when it comes to accounting, that is one field where it is extremely technical, and every number, everything must be accounted for. Another career that we can see for Mercury Saturn would be working for the government, especially like the post office or working with mail, because Mercury represents mail or letters or writing or anything within the government that deals with. This can even include being like a clerk from within a government position. So you may work in a courthouse, or you may be a clerk, or you may be an assistant, or you may handle a lot of the paperwork. Mercury Saturn can also represent having to travel for work. So Mercury and Saturn tends to represent the opportunity to travel. So this combination, part of your work may include having to travel, having to move, and even just taking natal astrology aside, if you've ever had a transit of Saturn coming across your Mercury or vice versa, but mainly Saturn across your Mercury, you may have experienced a delay with the travel, whereby you may have had a vehicular malfunction. You may experience extremely heavy traffic during that time when Saturn is transiting your Mercury, or you could experience some sort of obstruction or issue while you're on the road, which could include maybe getting stopped by the police or being involved in a car accident. That can be a combination just in mundane astrology, but also in natal astrology. So be careful on the road, because you could experience some difficulties when it comes to transportation and movement. Um, Especially if you have a planet. This is some free game I'm gonna give y'all. If you have Mercury and Saturn and a planet in your chart that's at the 14th degree, pay attention to that planet that's at the 14th degree, because that's gonna work itself into how that Mercury and Saturn is manifesting, particularly when it comes to difficulties with transportation. Now, another career for Mercury and Saturn could be anything that involves having to have great organizational skills, because Mercury Saturn is going to show where you have to take information and condense it and contain it. And so that could include having to teach people, especially older people, when you have Mercury and Saturn together. Now, from a biological standpoint, I mentioned that Mercury represents the nerves. So with the Mercury and Saturn, there could be an issue with the nerves. Your nervous system may not be functioning properly. For some people, this can represent anxiety or an issue whereby these people may not have issues with their skin, such as not being able to feel certain sensations, which is, if I'm not mistaken, pretty common with people who may be suffering from some form of diabetes. So I've seen Mercury Saturn show up more so corroboratively in the charts of people who have diabetes. Obviously, this is not a diabetic aspect. I'm not diagnosing anybody, but I'm just saying, you may have a certain illness that may cause you to not be able to experience certain sensations on your skin. Not always, but no one aspect exists in a vacuum. You have to look at the entire chart. Mercury having rulership over communication and speech. Mercury Saturn can represent someone who can be quite uncommunicative and silent, but it can show up in the charts of people who may have difficulties with speech, difficulties with communication. And lastly, because Mercury has rulership over the digestive system, Mercury Saturn can represent a sluggish digestive system or certain issues with your digestive system. Now, from a sociological standpoint, Mercury Saturn can manifest as a difficult adolescence, a difficult upbringing. So Mercury has rulership over your life mainly when you are before you hit puberty and when you learn how to speak. So when you're born, you're under the dominion of the moon. You don't know how to do shit except eat and shit and cry. But once you know how to interact with your environment and communicate, and once you go to school and you can communicate with your peers and talk to people, that's the Mercury period. And the Venus period starts once your hormones start kicking in. You start trying to become a little whore. But anyways, before then, Mercury Saturn can represent a difficult adolescence, and so you may experience isolation, restriction, hard times, and difficulties during your adolescence if you have this aspect configuration in your birth chart. So I hope you all found this video informative and insightful. As always, if you do have Mercury Saturn, please drop down in the comments below and talk about your experience with this aspect, and let me know if anything that I said really stood out to you in terms of how it manifested in your own life or in the life of someone you may know. As always, please like this video, and if you haven't already done so, subscribe. And if you would like a personal reading, just send me an email. I have it on my channel, but I'll also put it in the description box. I do offer natal chart consultations, horary readings, as well as synastries and solar return readings. And so if that is something that you're interested in, definitely send me an email and we can go for there. Thank you for watching.